My name is Jennifer. I used to work on a graduate program hiring graduates for it before I moved into the careers world about a year ago. So I'm very familiar with the sort of graduate interview processes that all of you will be going through, or maybe have started going through already. And one of the main things that we do with students within the college at NCI is actually prepare them for these interviews. So we are really happy to be here to go through the different elements of interviewing, and we will cover, I guess, a number of different things around preparation, how to go through them, the sort of dreaded one-way interviews, which I'm sure you're all becoming more familiar with, and then the sort of follow-up after you've completed the interview. We are delighted to take any questions that you have at the end, any scenarios or questions that you can think of that maybe have been challenging to you. Do put them in. Now, we can't guarantee that we'll give you the perfect answer, but we definitely think that we'd be able to help you maybe structure some answers to some difficult questions if you'd like to share any of them that you've received earlier as well. So I'm going to let Connor quickly introduce himself, and then we'll start off by talking about the number one thing you need to do as you're preparing for an interview. So I'll hand over to Connor really quickly.
Thanks, Jen. So I suppose just to give you a brief overview of myself as well, I'm a career changer. I originally worked as a secondary school teacher. I then moved into recruitment and worked for professional services recruitment for about 18 months. And then I moved into the careers department in NCI, so mainly working with students kind of on postgraduate and master's programs at the minute, with a bit of a variety kind of from my recruitment background as well. And so I kind of dealt with roles at various levels. Yeah, so I suppose like we may as well get going really. You know, we're kind of short on time. So I suppose what I'd like to start with initially is kind of before you actually get to the interview stage. So impressions and making a positive first impression are really important. So I would say kind of even in the application process, when you're submitting your CV, when you're, you know, you might be applying online or directly through email, and that's your first chance to make an impression. So you really want to be coming off as professional as possible in every interaction you have with the company, from the first conversation you have with someone on reception to the junior person in HR or recruitment you deal with, because you'd be mad to think that those conversations aren't being relayed up the line. And you know, if you're making a bad impression with someone who seems unimportant to you, you can be guaranteed they're going to have a conversation with the manager before the interview takes place. So kind of just to keep that in mind, I suppose, professional tone in your emails, making sure all the basics in your CV and in terms of formatting, you know, spelling, grammar, all that kind of stuff is squared away and it's not going to cause you any problems, because that's, you know, as a bare minimum, you should be going in with kind of a professional industry standard CV. Yeah, and then I suppose in terms of actually, you know, once you've got the interview and you're starting to sit down and do some prep for it, it is really important. And I suppose it's something that can cause quite a lot of nerves for many people. Because, you know, most of the time we'll go long periods between doing interviews, and then you might do a series of interviews in a row, but it might have been 3 or 4 years since you actually did one. So the first piece I think we'll look at is actually a bit of research, Jen. And so in terms of kind of what to prepare beforehand, I would start off with a few core pillars really. So once you should already have the job spec from when you applied. So I would go through the job spec in detail, take out the pieces that you think are the most relevant bits of information, the things that you'll be doing as part of your responsibilities in the role, and start actually writing out answers for some of those questions, or how you would address that particular task with that particular responsibility, and how you'll demonstrate that you've got relevant experience or relevant qualifications for that. So starting off with the job spec, then the next thing I would do is research the company in detail. So their own website's a great source of information, but I would be using LinkedIn kind of as my primary research tool, because companies have a huge amount of information available online. So, you know, you should know the basics in terms of what's the main purpose of the company, what areas do they focus on, and how is the company split up? Is it a multinational company? Is it based in Ireland? Might you have colleagues who are in Singapore or Poland? Could you have a manager who's based in London or the US? You know, there's all sorts of things like that can come into play. And then outside of that, it's just understanding what the core principles and drivers are for the company. So you might be working in one very niche role, but you really need to have an understanding of what the business does generally. Because in a lot of cases, I suppose employers like to have their ego stroked. So they want to know that you are genuinely interested in their company and that you really want to work for them. You're not just applying for every job that's out there. And maybe you are, that's fine, but just don't tell them that. So yeah, company, next thing will be the people in the company. So the people who might be on your team, the people who might be your manager, director, above that, anyone you could be interacting with either on a daily basis or maybe kind of less regularly. I do a bit of research, look them up online, find their LinkedIn's. Like most companies have their employees listed on LinkedIn. So you can go in there, you can start searching for people who seem to have the right job title for what you're going to be going into. And I'd use it as a tool to get a bit of an advantage. You know, you can check what do they have on their LinkedIn profile. Are they describing any skills that maybe I'm not mentioning? Do they have something listed in the responsibilities for the job that maybe isn't mentioned or doesn't go into detail on the job spec, but actually they seem to be prioritizing that as one of their core tasks. So maybe it's something you can work into the interview. And then outside of that, the next thing to really, I suppose, research and prepare is yourself. Is to kind of break down in detail what exactly your skills are, why you're relevant for this role, and why they should hire you. You know, it's not a charity exercise. They're not going to hire you out of the goodness of their heart. So you really need to make it as obvious as possible to them that you are the right person. And that's where I think, and we're going to talk about this in more detail, but matching the job spec, trying to mirror phrases that are being used, kind of key skills, technical skills, and soft skills that they're mentioning. These are all things you want to have a well-rounded answer prepared in relation to. So I suppose, Jen, kind of, I've done the what to prepare, but you might talk a little bit about kind of how best to prepare and how to go about that.
Yeah. So I think, you know, understanding those key bits about research, about, you know, the job, the company, the people interviewing you, and knowing yourself are really, really important. When it comes down to the sort of more practical tips of, well, what do I do about this? There's a couple things I think that are really important to understand. And one of those is what makes us an effective communicator. By the time you've got into the interview stage, the CV that you have submitted or the application form that you've sent in has done the guts of the work of defining your qualifications and making you a match for that job. So by the time you get into the interview, a lot of that is really about how do you communicate and are you going to be a good fit? Does what you say on your CV actually translate to who you are as a person? And do you sound like somebody who's going to be a good fit for the role, a good fit for the company, and have potential to grow within that role as well? And that's really, really important for a graduate. So when we look at how do we effectively communicate throughout the interview, something that's really important to understand is what effective communication is. And when we look at it from the breakdown from how we communicate, about 55% of our communication is determined by our body language. So it's determined by things like eye contact, by how we sit up and lean forward when we're talking to somebody rather than slouching back and glancing away like this, right? So our body language tells us a lot about how engaged we are in the process that we're in, how much we know about what we're talking about, and give somebody a really, really strong impression about whether you are going to be a good fit for them. So body language as being 55% of your answer, it makes it a really, really important thing to practice. Tone of voice then accounts for about 38% of what you communicate. So if I sound enthusiastic, if I sound earnest, if I sound passionate, that is going to be a lot more memorable than somebody who sounds monotone. And then the final piece of communication is the content. And I think when we're preparing for interviews, there's a lot of time that can sometimes be spent on stressing about the content and the exact words that we use in our competency answers in our STAR frameworks. But if we use that example and don't say it with the right tone of voice, or we use poor body language, in many cases, it won't actually matter what we've said because how we've said it doesn't communicate the value of the content. So in order for that content to be understood and to be connected with, it's really important that those other two elements are right. So what I like to tell students to do in terms of practicing this, and I think, you know, interviewing, it's not a skill that we're all born with. Some people may find it less intimidating than others, but it is a skill that is developed through practice. So one of the biggest things that you can do in terms of preparing for an interview, once you've done your research, is to practice answering questions and to practice doing that aloud. So how I would start this, and if interviewing is very, very new to you, I would have a think about what the common types of questions are, and we might go into those a little bit later. And you can get them from your careers advisor. They'll have loads of resources for you. So take some common questions, write down your answers after you've done all of this research. Practice your answers in front of a mirror. So I know it's going to seem really awkward, but just practice standing in front of a mirror and watching yourself talk. Watch how your body language communicates. Do you get really tense and do your shoulders sit up here? Do you maybe have a tic or a nervous habit? I know that I actually do this a lot with my ears when I'm really nervous, and I didn't notice that until I started recording myself. And some people do exactly what Connor just did there, right? And do this when they get a bit uncomfortable or when they're like really trying to concentrate. So notice those things, right? And in the mirror piece, you're not stressing about what you're saying. You're just looking at, well, what does my body language look like? Do I look engaged? Did I use my hands as I'm talking? And I know that right now you can't see that I'm actually using my hands on the screen, but for me, using my hands makes me feel like I'm actually having a conversation with you where I'm getting from point A to point B. And I think that that's quite visible. So do it in front of the mirror. If you get a bit braver, put your phone in front of you. And this is where practice for those one-way interviews can come in real handy, right? Is practicing talking into a screen and have that face on camera at it so that you actually see yourself doing it. You put yourself in a slightly uncomfortable and unnerving position, record yourself giving the answer, and then play it back with the sound off if you like, right? And just look at the body language. Once you've figured out the body language piece, a huge thing, remember to smile, right? That's something that we forget to do in interviews. But if we think about how I want to build a relationship with somebody that I don't know, it's very unlikely that I go in and shake their hands and not smile once during my introduction and say, hi, yeah, my name is Jennifer. It's really nice to meet you. I hope that we can be best friends in the future, right? We don't really do that. And interviewing is about relationship building. So it's really important to be able to control your body language and be aware of what you're doing. So go in and practice in front of a mirror, go in and practice in front of a recording, record yourself doing it, record yourself multiple times, right? And then listen to your tone of voice, then listen to your content. And if you can figure out your body language and your tone of voice, you'll have practiced the content now a few times and the content will be fine. So that would be like, very basic things, practice, practice, practice. And I think that that's a really good way to start practicing. When you're in this, I've said this a few times, right? Be earnest, be passionate, and be enthusiastic. And that doesn't mean that you need to put on a bubbly character if you don't have one, right? Not everybody is super bubbly. I'm not one of those people, but I can still be earnest about why I really want this job. And I can show that in an enthusiastic way without having to be chirpy. And that's fine as well. If you are a super bubbly person, then be a super bubbly person, right? So be who you are. We'll talk a bit about mirroring and matching as we go through, but don't forget to be yourself. That is what you're going to be hired on, and that will mean that you're a good fit for the company. So don't afraid to be you, but do remember that it is important how you communicate along with that. Okay, so that's that. We might we'll move on because I know that we are a little bit pressed for time. Connor, will you give us maybe some quick tips on just setting up for the interview itself, in terms of getting set up?
Definitely. So I suppose I'd echo a lot of the points Jen just made there. And I think one of the things that kind of stood out to me was that the interview is an exercise in relationship building. So I suppose like we touched on nerves earlier, but one thing in terms of being nervous about an interview, it's completely natural. Most people will get some level of nerves either in build up to the interview or beforehand. But one thing to put your mind at ease, if you've gotten an interview in the first place, they already like you. Your CV has done half the work. No to waste managers' time bringing people in to interview you. They're going to have to work out schedules for 3 or 4 different people to come and interview you. They're not going to do that if they don't think you can already do the job. So I would go into the interview thinking they've already put a tick beside my name. They think I'm technically capable of doing this. Now it's just, this is a big thing in an interview because this is what it really boils down to. Can they work with you for 6 months or a year or 3 years? Are you going to be somebody that they can deal with on a daily basis and not hate their job? And that sounds silly, but in reality, you're going to spend, or you're going to interact with your colleagues more than you will with families in a lot of cases. So being, I suppose, kind of personable and as Jen said, letting your real personality come out in a professional way is really important here. You don't want to be too stilted. So kind of in terms of setting up for the interview, like some of the very basic things, I suppose, is making sure that you have a workspace set up. You know where you're going to do the interview. You have the timings down. Housemates, family, everyone has been given the run, sent out the door, go for a walk for an hour or whatever. Make sure you've got a space where you can actually do the interview and you're going to be comfortable. Some of that's going to involve setting up, like making sure the lighting is good, making sure you're in a decent chair, you've got back support, camera angle is good. Because look, realistically, for the foreseeable future, interviews are going to be done remotely. So we need to be prepared to do that. And in terms of some of what Jen was saying about body language, because a lot of the normal body language cues have been taken away from us with remote interviewing, being more expressive, being maybe a little bit more kind of excitable or cheerful or just smiling where appropriate, be quite responsive to people's questions. And just in terms of being responsive, in terms of the actual content of what you say, it's really important that you respond directly to the question you're asked. The worst impression you can make in an interview is you go in, somebody asks you a question, and you just steamroll through their question with a pre-prepared answer that you really wanted to get off your chest. Because straight away, that one person who's asked you the question, they don't like you. It's a no in their column for you from the interview. So, be responsive. Not that you can't get onto the content you want to discuss, but at least make sure you're addressing in some way the question, and then you're moving on to the area you want to discuss. Small things like, I suppose, one advantage of the remote interview, you can have post-its up around your screen with tips, so you're not looking down all the time at notes, which you wouldn't do in a real interview. So we can cheat a little bit and have some tips and some pointers to get you back on track. But yeah, I think one of the biggest things is just going in with a sense of confidence already built up, that they're not wasting their time by bringing me in here. They're doing it because they already think I can do this job. So now it's just about convincing them that essentially you're better in person than you are on paper, which hopefully most of us think we are. Yeah, so I suppose kind of in terms of the setup, those are the main tasks really. Outside of that, it's just making sure that you actually take appropriate time to address each question. Perfectly fine to ask someone to repeat the question, especially now that we're remote. You've got the perfect excuse, internet connection issue, whatever. Can you ask that question again? And sorry, that's just occurred to me. Make sure you're on decent internet and make sure it's not going to drop halfway through your interview or something like that.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. So I think we'll move on. I know that people are, a lot of you are preparing for virtual and pre-recorded interviews at the minute. So I just thought it might be helpful to kind of share some of the more common questions that will come up in screening phone calls, these like sort of one-way video interviews, and also even at the start of a sort of first round face-to-face interview as well. So I can pop these questions into the chat, but there's also an article that I've written on LinkedIn where all of this information is. So if you want to go onto my profile, don't stress too much about taking notes. Like this is all there in an article for you. So the key questions that I think are really important to always know the answers to before you go into any interview. Why do you want to work here? Right. So that means that you need to know something about the company and demonstrate that you've researched something a little bit more in depth than, I know it's a big multinational that's a food company, right? It needs to be a little bit more detailed than that. So find something that resonates with you about what the company is and what the company does, and see if you can sort of like match that to your own story. Why do you want this job, right? So why do you want to be an accountant? Why do you want to be a software developer? Why do you want to be an HR administrator? That's about knowing the job spec inside out, right? And again, this whole time we're referring back to how much research did you do to prepare yourself for the interview? Why do you want to maybe get onto this graduate program? So if you are interviewing for a role that's part of a development program or something like that, there might be key elements of that program which are a little bit different to just going into an entry-level role. So there might be a question about, why our graduate program in particular, rather than just the HR administrator. So knowing something about what the program offers, about the program outcomes, maybe about where graduates of that program have gone to in their careers, and showing a bit of ambition as well, because oftentimes those programs are all about, they're about career progression, they're about leadership, they are about sort of fast tracking you as much as the company is able to into slightly more senior positions or roles within the company. And then the final question that I think, this is your elevator pitch that you do need to be practicing, is the tell me a bit about yourself, right? So the tell me about yourself is the most common way to start an interview. And it is a question that every interviewer expects that you will be able to answer, right? Because it is about you. Now, the thing that you do have to be a little bit careful of, and I would highly recommend tailoring this answer slightly, is that you want to tell the story about you in the context of the role and company that you're interviewing for. So I could talk about me and how I love skiing, but actually for the role of a careers advisor, it's not that relevant. It's interesting, but unless I loved skiing and had then gone on to become a ski instructor where I had delivered a lot of sessions and one-to-one coaching, or maybe worked with difficult clients, actually me loving skiing as a hobby is not hugely relevant to the interview, right? So it needs to be the story about you and what you've achieved. That is what the hiring manager or the recruiter would like to hear. So as motivational questions, those are really key. For me, competency questions that I think come up a lot for graduates would be around resilience, communication, and teamwork. I don't know, Connor, if you have any others that you think are really, sort of big questions at the minute that are likely to come up.
Yeah, I suppose one is conflict tends to come up a lot, and it could be conflict with external stakeholders, so dealing with clients or customers, or it could be internally on the team. A lot of the time they just want to see how you might respond in that scenario. So, can they put you in a client-facing role, or are you someone who might kind of get panicked in that situation, and maybe that's kind of 6 months or a year down the line for you. But just in relation to the competency questions, Jen, I think like I'm sure a lot of people are aware of the STAR method of answering, so situation, task, action, result. And the way to think about that, I think, as well, because that can sometimes become quite complex in your head. I would just prepare scenarios. So essentially 3 or 4 situations that you've been in, either in work or in your academics, that have demonstrated some of the competencies. So you might have one situation you were involved in, that you were working on a project that involves maybe some client management, maybe it involved organization, prioritizing things, maybe it involved dealing with team members. So that you can use that one situation to answer multiple questions. So if you prepare kind of 3 or 4 of those situations, then essentially you're not going in and just rambling off a question. You're telling a story. You're telling a contained story that you can apply to multiple scenarios.
Yeah. Thanks. And I think, again, like coming back to that relevant piece, it's great if you can tell a story. If you've had experience working in a customer service job and the role that you're applying for involves a lot of like customer contact, the recruiter would almost be expecting you to tell a story about how you resolved conflict in your customer service job, not how you resolved conflict, in your sports or a hobby or something like that. Now, I think, again, you might have a very good example, but I think if you can have examples that are maybe, as relevant, if you have relevant experience to the job that you're applying for, do try and use examples from those jobs. I think, when I was applying for this job, I didn't talk about 2 of the jobs I'd had at all in my interview. I only talked about the job that was actually very relevant to what I'm doing now. And that was to try and make my experience seem more relevant. So like how you might tailor a CV to a job, it is quite important to think about, well, how would I tailor this answer to this particular company? And that might change company to company, and there might be companies that love to hear about extracurriculars, and they say that, as part of their program, that they love people who, do things outside of work, that they love people who volunteer. So in that case, like, absolutely go and use those examples in your competency examples. And it's not that you shouldn't do that, but I think if you do have a very relevant experience, do try and think of examples where you can talk about that experience and show, how relevant your history is to getting into that role.
Thanks, Steve.
Okay. Yep.
Sorry.
Hi, Roy.
Sorry.
I think we're done, actually.
No, just I can see the questions are coming through, and I just like to touch on some of them, if that's okay.
Yep.
One of the main ones there was indeed, how do you talk about yourself effectively? I think we've really have covered that. I think that's something that is very much on people's minds. And another one that I know is commonly asked is, at the end of an interview, they say, "And do you have any questions for us?" And people can kind of go, would you each have maybe 2, Connor? Maybe you have maybe 2 or 3 examples of stock good comebacks there.
Yeah, I suppose like definitely have 1 or 2 stock ones. So like one very good one I think the companies like to hear is what would be a successful first 3 months for me in this job? What could I achieve in the first 3 months that would add value to the company? Because I suppose you're already putting yourself in the situation that you've got the job, that they're already giving it to you, and now you're thinking about solutions focused. How can I deal with this? How can I deal with that?
Right.
Another one might be around upskilling. Is there anything you can read, or any courses you can do online, any particular technology that's going to be quite important in the role that maybe you need to get up to speed on? Again, you're kind of putting yourself in the job already, and now they're thinking of you as the successful candidate rather than just someone who's interviewing.
And Jen, say if there's if you're well prepared in terms of your CV, you have the general skills, you have the academic background they're looking for, but there's a blind spot, there's something they ask you that you hadn't thought of. It could be a technical aspect or something that you haven't covered off, or you hadn't put in your CV. How should you answer questions that you're not sure of if they're not ones you can actually back up by what's in your CV? It's kind of, should you just say, listen, I wasn't aware that was, required in this role, or how would you kind of broach that sort of awkward situation?
Yeah. So, okay. So I think, yeah. So yes, and to that question, I suppose. So, I guess the number one thing to think about is like, don't lie in an interview, right? So if someone's asking you if you have experience doing this, or if you're familiar with a software or a tool or a methodology or something like that you just don't know, don't go and say that you've done it, because you will be found out. What if they ask a follow-up question to that about, something in more detail? You've just said you are aware of this, and then they ask an even more technical question, and suddenly, guess what, you're caught, right? So I think don't lie. You can always, I guess, if it's something kind of technical that you're not sure of, you can say, do you know what, maybe I haven't heard of that software. Is it similar to something like this, right? So you might be like, I am familiar with something else. We haven't studied that one in college, but if it is like this type of tool, I'm sure I can get on board with it. I suppose if it's a question that's more a question that just throws you, and maybe it's one of those competencies of, can you give me an example of a time when, and your brain goes completely blank. It's always okay to say, is it okay if I give an example outside of my work experience for that? So maybe you have something from a hobby or something personal to you. So you could always ask, can I give a personal example? If it's something that's really stumping you, it's also okay to say to the interviewer, do you know what, I'm actually just a little bit nervous. Would we be able to come back to that question later if you think that, a bit of time might give you a strategy? Okay. And sometimes, do you know what, I've had people that I've hired who said, do you know what, I'm actually just really struggling to answer that question. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on what you're looking for, or rephrase the question in a different way, or explain to me, what skill is it that you're exactly looking for, so that I can try and find a relatable answer. And, interviewers, as Connor said, like, they've taken time out of their own days because they want to hire you. It makes their job easier if they can hire you. Yeah. So if you can make that job easier on them to ask the right question to help you answer it, then go for it and ask those questions to help you out.
Okay. We're not going to get through all the questions, but one or two more I just want to try and get to very quickly. And kind of, this is it's a nice situation to be in some ways, but it's also difficult. What when you're doing interview, when asked if you were applying for other jobs, should you be honest if you are, even if it makes you look less interested in the position that you're going for? Yeah,
I would always, I think it's, from a recruiter's point of view, I always found it really important to kind of let companies know. Because the other thing is, it's showing them that you're in demand. You're not just interviewing with them and you've got nothing else going on. You have 2 or 3 other companies who are interested in you. And I would be honest about what round you're at. Like, I actually had a situation last week with a student who just graduated in January. He had 2 job offers on the table, essentially. So one from company X, they'd offered him the job on the Wednesday. They'd given him a week to consider it. He had second round interview with company Y on Friday. They wanted to interview him again, but they said the earliest they could do it was Thursday. He was able to go back to them and say, look, I have a job offer. I have to make a decision by Wednesday. Is there any chance you can meet me on Monday or Tuesday? And all of a sudden, there had been no time on Monday or Tuesday, and the time slot appeared. So they met him at 9:30 Monday morning, and they then offered him the job as well. So it can kind of speed up the process, and it can help you get some control as well. Now, I wouldn't be fabricating things or kind of blowing it up out of proportion, because a bird in hand is better than a bird in the bush, I suppose. Like, you need something tangible before you can start playing games.
Okay. And we've got some more questions here on competency-based interviews and career change interviews. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put some answers to those together, and we will send them out to registrants of this this session, because we actually have a poll result as well, which is what I touch on before we wrap up. Just on the different format, just touching on different formats of interviews. We asked the question, in what interview format do you think you would perform best? And we had 3 options: in person, virtual interviews for Zoom or Teams, or pre-recorded video interviews. 70% said in person, 20% was virtual interviews, and 10% was the, let's face it, dreaded pre-recorded interview. So some interesting results there, and it shows what people are comfortable with. And just the very last question I'm going to ask and put it, that is to yourself, Jen. We have literally a minute, but someone has said here, social anxiety about returning to person interviews, something to be afraid of, something something that you may have heard much about, or from students about, I don't know if I can go back to one-to-ones.
Yeah, I think, do you know what? I think that's something that everyone is going to find a little bit difficult. Sure. I don't think, I think the thing for students to recognize is that, like, you're not going to be the only people in that place. People who are now used to interviewing online are also going to have that same anxiety of having to do this back face to face again. So, everybody returning to work is going to be in a very similar position. None of us are used to being around more than 1 or 2 people at a time, and definitely not in an indoor space. So that social anxiety is something that everybody is going to be experiencing. And so I think just, don't feel like you're alone in that. Interviewers don't want to make you uncomfortable. They don't want to make the process difficult for you in any way. So if you are feeling nervous, if there is something that is stressing you out, it's always okay to just say, I'm actually just really nervous. This is my first interview that I've done, in person, right? Or in a formal setting or something. Can I just have a couple of minutes, but I've had a glass of water, and take your time.
Will be
grappling absolutely fine.
With the same sort of thing, I suppose. Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it in context as well. Sorry we didn't get through all the questions. We got quite a lot, but it shows the level of interest in this, because it's such a unique experience for everybody. And if you are doing any interviews in the near future, best of luck. Listen, I'd like to thank both Jen and Connor from NCI